Okay, we're in chapter 26. This is in the Art Scroll English translated Rashi. It's on page 281. So the day before, we saw the beginning. There was a famine in the land. Aside from the first famine, that was the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Avimelech, king of the Philistines, to Gerar. And that's going south. There's a famine. He's going south. Hashem appeared to him and said, "Do not descend to Egypt." Because that's what Isaac had in mind, as Rashi says, just like his father did when there was a famine. And he went to Egypt, so that seems to be the thing to do, the family thing to do. So Hashem says to him, Hashem appeared to him and said, "Do not descend to Egypt. Don't do that. Dwell in the land that I shall tell you." Gur ba'aretz hazot, sojourn in this land. Now, I will just mention, even though Rashi doesn't mention this, if you read it carefully, my recommendation is pretend you're 9 years old. And you're reading it, and you want to make sense out of it, and sometimes you have a dictionary, if you need a dictionary to look up words, and just read it very simplistically. If you get into trouble, then you know that something needs analysis. But start in the simplest possible way. And then, if you get into trouble, then you try to articulate as best as you can what the difficulty is, and then you look for a solution. So here it says, "Dwell in the land I shall tell you," when? Tomorrow, next week, I'll tell you in the future. In the very next words, he tells him what to do. Dwell here. So you ought to stop and think, hey, what's going on? Just tell him, dwell here. No, in the land I shall tell you, and then here. It's very funny. You would never do that. And the answer seems to be that when Isaac hears the words, "the land I shall tell you," his reaction is Alaska, Nigeria, Adelaide, Australia, whatever you say. That's all Kodesh Baruch Hu wants. He wants that open-ended acceptance, that open-ended commitment. Then he tells him right away. Isn't it that he should be in doubt for a day or a week? No, he wants that. He wants that reaction. So then he says to him, "Sojourn in this land, and I'll be with you. I'll bless you. For to you and your offspring will I give all these lands. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Avram your father. I will increase your offspring like the stars of the heavens. Give to your offspring all these lands. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your offspring." This is where we ended last time. "Because Avram obeyed my voice, observed my safeguards, my commandments, my edicts, and my Torahs." And again, although Rashi doesn't mention it, we will read the Rashi now about the details of what he says here. It's very, very noteworthy that God speaks to Isaac twice, giving him blessings each time, and both times he says, "because of Abraham." This never happens again. God gives Jacob blessings, he never says, "because of your parents," nor anywhere else. It's absolutely unique, which means that there's a certain dependence of Isaac on Abraham that you don't find anywhere else. Now, this is a long story, and I'm not going to take you through the whole story, but let's say the first step is to recognize, as we've said many times, Abraham stands for the quality of loving kindness, and Isaac stands for the quality of strict justice. And although they are both divine qualities in some sense, they're not equal. The purpose of all creation is loving kindness. Strict justice is applied only as a means to or as an application of loving kindness. Those are two different ideas. A can be a means to be, or A itself can be an application of be. But in all cases, when you have strict justice applied, it's only because the motivation is from loving kindness. So, if God gives a blessing to Abraham, Abraham can represent that blessing directly because he has the quality which is the purpose of the whole creation. Isaac can't do that. He has a dependent quality, a quality that exists only because it serves the quality of loving kindness. And here you're seeing that in the blessings that God gave to Abraham, and that God gave blessings to Isaac. And they're not blessings for them as individuals, they're blessings of them as the founders of a nation. What we're being told is that through God's interaction with Abraham, there's a certain effect on the nation. And through God's interaction with Isaac, because Isaac's a continuation of Abraham, there's a foundation for the nation. And later, there's an interaction between God and Jacob, and that's a foundation for the nation independently because Jacob has his own connection to the quality of loving kindness. So there's an asymmetry here. And this is carried out. You see this in the Siddur, you see this in Rosh Hashanah, you see this in many, many places. I'm just pointing out that this should be, you should be conscious of this and remember it because it's a very important piece of textual expression. Now in this verse you have a number of different items mentioned. Abraham obeyed my voice, observed my safeguards, my commandments, my edicts, and my Torahs. Now Rashi is concerned to explain them all, to explain in which what their differences are, what they describe. And the first problem that Rashi faces is this. The first words are, he obeyed my voice, and then the verse goes on, and you have to read it this way, and in addition to obeying my voice, he observed my safeguards, my commandments, my edicts, and my Torahs. So the first question that will leap to your mind is, what more is there to obeying my voice than observing my safeguards, my commandments, my edicts, and my Torahs? Isn't that, sort of a nice long list? And doesn't it look like it's comprehensive? What more could there possibly be to obeying my voice than fulfilling the four of those? So Rashi says, at the bottom of 282, when I tested him, that's something else entirely. That's outside the framework of the legislation of the Torah. That's life circumstances that require a difficult and courageous response. So Rashi distinguishes it that way. Then he says, observe my safeguards. This refers to decrees instituted for keeping a distance from transgression, meaning rabbinic laws. Now, the word here is very good because in the Hebrew, lishmor means to safeguard, to protect. So if you call a rule a mishmar or a mishmeres, it means it's a rule that was instituted to protect something else. Most rules aren't like that. If they were, you'd have a lopsided legal system. Most rules have a direct effect on what you're supposed to do. Here, this is a rule that's instituted to protect other rules. So that's why Rashi explains it that way. And they protect the commandments of the Torah. He used the word for negative commandments. Let me give some examples. Second term is mitzvahs, my commandments. This refers to matters which, had they not been written in the Torah, would nevertheless have been fit to have given as commands. Meaning, there are certain things which, even if the Torah had not written them, we ourselves would have known that they are rules that have to be followed. This is what's called elsewhere in the Torah mishpat. The word mishpat doesn't appear in this verse, but when you take it together with other words here, that's what this word mitzvah, which is very, very general, is left. That's the category it's left to describe. Now, this is a very important idea. Certain mitzvahs are logical in a sort of broad sense. people know you're not supposed to steal, you're not supposed to murder, you're not supposed to injure or hurt people physically or psychologically. You're supposed to help people who are in need. You're supposed to pursue justice. These are things which people naturally know that should be done. The Torah's view of these things is pretty subtle. Maimonides articulates this, but I think it's based on the Gemara and Eruvin also. The view is not that it's in your DNA, so much for sociobiology and psychobiology. It's not in the DNA. What you're born with is an ability to respond to certain types of experiences in a certain way. And if you have a normal upbringing, have a normal range of experience, then these will be a natural outcome of that experience. It's not programmed in, it's programmed to develop under the stimulus of normal circumstances. The Gemara in Eruvin has a very, I would say, dramatic expression of this. It says that if the Torah hadn't described to us appropriate principles and characteristics, we would have learned privacy from a cat. You don't see cats carry out their private activities. We would have learned industry from an ant, because ants, you see them, they're always working. Now, the thoughtful person will ask, why wouldn't we have learned a lack of privacy from those animals that don't hide? Why wouldn't we have learned sloth from the sloth? You know, a sloth can sleep 16 hours a day. What does it mean that if I didn't have instruction, I would see this and be impressed by this? Why do you assume I wouldn't be impressed by that and develop in the opposite way? The Gemara is saying exactly what I just said. And by the way, this was brought to people's attention by Noam Chomsky in the 60s and 70s. I lived through that revolution. You see the cat, you see the way the cat behaves, and you are already programmed to be impressed by that. If you never saw it, you might never think of it yourself, but you're programmed to see that and say, "Wow, look at that. That's fitting. It's appropriate." And to see animals that are unconcerned, you think, "That's an animal. I don't want to live like that." And the same with the ant. Be impressed with the industry and not be impressed with laziness. We're saying this about what we call the moral commandments, where under the conditions of normal development, you see and you understand, you see the consequences, and you think, that's not right, it shouldn't be done, or this should be right, and it should be done. Why is this important? It's important because, I said over and over again, under normal circumstances, normal development, suppose someone's development is abnormal, then you could prevent the development of these characteristics. So Rav Dessler describes a person who, there's a band of robbers living in the mountains, and they have their own little tiny sub-society, and in that society they teach that stealing is appropriate. The brave and the courageous and people with initiative steal, and other people are slaves to their weakness and their fear, and it's glorious to steal, and that's all he ever hears growing up. He only hears the glorification of stealing. Says Rav Dessler, you may end up in a position where the person has no free will. Because in order to have free will, you have to at least know that it's wrong. Otherwise, there's nothing to decide about. You simply do it because everything's in its favor. So if it were programmed into the person that stealing is wrong, then the influence of society couldn't conquer that. But it isn't programmed into the person. What's programmed into the person is to be impressed by a certain normal development to come to have that conviction that it's wrong. And if your development isn't normal, then you won't come to that conviction. I would imagine that if you lived in a situation where there's more than enough of everything, then the ideas of property the ideas of stealing would never arise because there would be no need for it. If you take my toothbrush, I have another one on the table. So take it. What do I need? It doesn't matter to me. I don't lose anything by it. So, and that's the way. So Rashi here talks about mitzvos in this context of some of these which, had they not been commanded, we would by ourselves have known through this kind of development that they were appropriate. But of course, there are many mitzvos that aren't like that either. Many laws of the Torah. I don't use the word mitzvahs here because that's the word we're explaining. Chukosai, that is, Rashi says, matters which the drive toward evil and other nations of the world take issue with. Everyone has, we have commentaries from 800 years ago that talk about a natural rebelliousness. Don't tell me what to do. This is American, right? Don't tell me what to do. Don't push me around. Get out of my way. Leave me to my own devices. I'm a free man. I make my own decisions. People feel that because of God also. Don't tell me what to do. You have a big list of things to do. So that inner drive motivates a certain rebelliousness, and other nations of the world which don't subscribe to our tradition and they look at the practices of the Torah, many of them are not self-explanatory to them, and they say, there's no meaning to this. It's just arbitrary, and it's time-consuming, and it costs money, and it's meaningless. Abraham followed all the rules, whether they were rules which your mind could consent to and affirm independently, or whether, listen carefully to my words, or whether they are rules which your mind would not affirm independently. I didn't say your mind would deny them. I said your mind would not affirm them. There's a big difference, right? Your mind might be neutral. It might say, I don't know. That's what this set of rules tells me to do. Yes, no, I have no opinion. It's not affirmed, but it's not denied. The Torah never requires us to do something absurd. Never. It may require us to do something without knowing the reason why, but that's not absurd. You do that with your doctor all the time. Okay, so that's chukos. And he gives some examples, like not eating pork, or not wearing shatnez, which is a combination of linen and wool in your garments. When Rashi says here, for there is no reason known to man for the matter, that's a little too strong. You see the bold print is the translation of Rashi's words, and the regular print is the editor's additions to make it read smoothly and to make it understandable. When Rashi says known, I think what he means is not commonly known, not typically known. The vast majority of our commentators say there are reasons for everything. It's just that they're not commonly known. Rather, the decree of the king, and he has the authority to make decrees. Now, having gone through all of those, what is my Torahs in the plural? And I will share with you. We had a friend, someone in the family who got involved with a Karaite. And the Karaites have all sorts of, they're dying out. There was a Karaite synagogue in the old city, but it closed. And they have complaints that the oral tradition is not genuine, and that we who follow the oral tradition aren't following the written Torah the way it's written. Okay, they have a whole long thing, and the Rishonim dealt with this, and it's easy to disprove their position. But one of the things they say is that they know the written Torah very well, because that's all they follow. And I saw in one of their writings, you believe in a written law and an oral law, but never is the word Torah used plural. I thought, wow, how could you say that? Here it is on the page. We just read it. And it's used also elsewhere in the Torah. It means that although they pride themselves that they're keeping the written Torah, they don't know that either. They don't pay attention to that either. They make other mistakes as well. So now he says it's plural to include the oral Torah. This is exactly what the Karaites deny. And also, not only the part of the oral Torah is, because the word, okay, I'll explain in a second. Oral laws transmitted to Moses at Sinai, but not including in the written text of the Torah. In other words, there's a vast body of Jewish law which is oral rather than written, and some of it is laws dictated by God to Moses and taught by Moses to the people, and some of it is discussions of those laws and applications of those laws and deductions from those laws and further legislation that the Sanhedrin added to our laws. The oral tradition has in it lots of strands. Now, I think this is very important because people have a misimpression as to the relationship between the written and the oral. Which came first historically? The written or the oral?
Following the Rashi, the oral.
The oral came first. Moses came down from the mountain with the tablets, which he then broke, and with all that God had taught him, 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain. The 5 books of Moses were written 40 years later. 40 years later. They lived for 40 years with only oral instruction. That's very important because, first of all, people assume, well, if you have a written text and then you have a commentary on the text, obviously the text comes before the commentary. That would be true if it were a commentary, but it's not a commentary, not at all. It was independently delivered information. And if you want an analogy, Rav Hirsch gives the following analogy. It's like taking notes in a lecture. The lecture comes first, the notes come afterwards. And not only that, but if you were at the lecture and you wrote down notes to remind you of the lecture, but you heard the lecture. So you're not going to write down the lecture word for word. You don't need that. But very often, what's written in the Torah can't stand on its own. It's not meant to stand on its own. It's meant to be a written subportion, 8% of what you heard orally, 8% which codifies it and gives it expression and puts it in a certain order and so forth and so on. But it's not meant to replace the oral. The oral came first. The oral is the context in which the written was presented. This answers the famous question, where does it say in the written Torah that there's an oral Torah? Why should it? Why should it? They've been dealing with the oral for 40 years. They need to have a signal that something that's going on for 40 years is really there. What do they need that? What do they need that for? My analogy is this. Every law passed in the United States by any legislative body at any level can be disqualified by the Supreme Court. If it's declared unconstitutional, it can be disqualified by the Supreme Court. There isn't a single law anywhere in the United States which reads as follows. This law says to do ABC, and if the Supreme Court will invalidate it, then it's null and void. No law has that written into it. Why? Because the laws are created in a context where the Supreme Court is functioning. Everybody knows that. You have to put it in the law. So similarly, there's no reason to expect that the written Torah is going to wave a flag and say, and by the way, there's another Torah. Certainly not to make a big deal out of it, since when it came into existence, everybody knew that. Okay, so there are hints here and there. And there are 1 or 2 laws where Rashi points out that the law couldn't possibly be understood if there weren't an oral accompaniment. But the idea that because the written doesn't say so, we have no reason to think that it exists, is just a nonsensical idea. And I will put in that this is one of the tricks that Christian missionaries use, and that is to say to a Jew who's not educated, you believe this, don't you? And the Jew thinks, no, did I ever hear that? Yeah, I think I did. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the missionary says, well, it's not in your book. It's not in your book. Try and find it. You won't find it there. And the Jew thinks, oh my God, it's not in my book. So, well then, where did it come from? Was it made up? I mean, It's not in the book. An educated Jew says, of course not. It's part of the oral tradition. So what? It's absolutely meaningless as a critique. Question?
If chronological order plays such an important part, how is it possible that the Torah was written and then Egypt happened, but it was written in the Torah that Egypt would happen, and all of it is, I mean, this was after Egypt, but like the rest of the Torah happened, right? And it was all written. And so I mean, how does chronological order work if like the Torah was written and it included the rest of history, right?
Let me see if I can get the exact time straight, because I think what I said now answered that. If you imagined Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 5 books of Moses, that would be a problem. For example, it would be written there that some years later, Korach is going to make a rebellion, and the earth is going to open up and swallow him alive. And imagine Korach reading that and say, "Oh, I'm not getting into that. I'm not having that future." Then it would come out to be false. That would be a problem. But I'm telling you that the book was written at the end of Moses' life. It was written after the events happened, not before the events happened.
Was there anything important that happened afterwards that was written in there?
There are open-ended predictions. There will come a time when the Jewish people will worship idols, and that will have certain effects, that sort of thing, but they're always open-ended. They're not specific at all. It doesn't say when or where or how. Just says that these things will happen. But other than that, no. And the concrete events, that's why it's important to know it was written down at the end of the 40 years. All of the history of the 40 years took place before the book was written down. That's why there isn't a chronological problem. Yeah.
So we mentioned that we have like certain program into our let's say life.
Yeah.
So is it perhaps through the or I would say the Torah study that we enable those programs to actually develop in the right manner?
Okay, I will say a little bit more about this, but this is a very large subject. We have this, just like, let me go back and put in the Chomsky, just a little bit about Noam Chomsky. How do children learn language? So, I mean, it's a big subject, and you can look it up. It's codified, it's on the web, it's everywhere. Chomsky argued that a child could not learn language on the basis of the language he hears spoken. He doesn't hear enough of it. He doesn't have enough contrasts to rule out all the possible wrong ways to understand, that to generalize the little evidence that he has of language. Chomsky argued that when a child grows up hearing language spoken, that triggers the module that's already in his brain, the language module, which has the basic structure of linguistic grammar built in, and then it just triggers, this one goes this way, and that one goes that way, and that one goes that way, and they get turned on. Just like, for example, similarly to the fact that newborn kittens are blind. That is to say, their brains don't process any visual information. And it takes days before they're able to respond to visual stimuli in any coordinated way. They don't learn that because you have to be able to pick up information to learn anything. No. When the eyes open, the brain starts to develop, and certain brain structures develop quickly on the pressure of visual stimuli, and then they're able to see. The visual cortex in the brain is already there, but it has to be turned on. So language is the same way, said Chomsky. One of the things he had with immigrants will come, and the parents who are immigrants don't speak the native language well, make all sorts of mistakes, and the kids hear their parents speaking it, and the kids intuit the right grammar on their own, because their brains are already preformed to have a full grammar. Parents are beyond that age. They don't have that operating, but the children do. There's a window of development beyond which the development can't take place anymore. By the way, same thing is true with kittens. If you prevent the kitten's sight from developing for a few months, it will never develop later, because that window of development has been passed. Okay, so now we're talking about moral development. It's a similar thing. Here, the moral development is not from learning Torah. I say it's from normal upbringing. And I contrasted it with people in the mountains who tell their children that stealing is wrong. The kind of development I'm talking about here applies to non-Jews as well as Jews, educated or uneducated. The child has siblings. The child goes out to play in the street. We always say it's wonderful when the child goes to school, especially the first child, because he learns that there are consequences to what he does. If he takes the toy, he's going to get it over the head, and he will sort of rearrange his conceptions of how the world should work. You lose something, you don't have it. You're holding it, and you drop it, and it breaks, so you don't have it. So then you learn to be careful not to break things. I mean, these are the kinds of experiences that lead to the development of these characteristics. I was not talking about Torah study, which at best, in any sense of understanding, begins at 8 or 9 or 10 years old. By that time, the child has lots of moral ideas. He has lots of preferences and priorities. So it's not certainly not Torah study that I was talking about. Torah study is a part, and it will help, and it's fine tunes, but I was not talking about that. Okay, you had a question?
I did.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Rob, if maybe this idea, I know it might be a little far-fetched, but can the Supreme Court be compared to the way that the rabbis are able to, in a way, nullify Torah laws in certain situations? Meaning, like the Supreme Court is able to nullify decrees that the president makes or something. So that the same principle that like the Supreme Court, the rabbis have, the Sanhedrin has the ability to.
Well, let's see. You're asking whether the Supreme Court nullification of a law or something that the president does, whatever, is similar to the way in which the rabbis operate. Well, let's be careful now. The Supreme Court isn't an authority that can nullify things. People can't just vote and say, no, don't do that. They can in this country. That's because this country is sort of out of balance in this respect, I think. The Supreme Court in this country is undemocratic. Elected officials don't determine who shall sit on the Supreme Court, unlike the United States, where the president who's elected has to nominate, and the Senate of people who are elected have to confirm. So the election, the electoral democratic process is the one that ultimately determines who shall sit on the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court can void what another authority does by declaring it unconstitutional. It's not that they have a power to say, we don't like it, so strike it down, like it is in this country. No, they have to declare it unconstitutional. In fact, exactly the same way, our Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, can say that a lower court made a decision and it's against the received law. Exactly the same way. It's applying the law to what happened and determining whether it's appropriate or inappropriate.
So in other words, the American civil system is more comparable to Torah law than...
I wouldn't say civil system. I don't want to say civil as opposed to criminal. No, the legal system. In that respect, yes, the Sanhedrin is, our Sanhedrin does more than that because it's a legislature also. It's not just judicial. But in the character of the highest judicial body, it assesses whether what has been done is consistent with the legislation under which you're living and draws the appropriate conclusion. That's all. In that respect, I think it is very, very similar. Yeah? Okay. So now, let's push on. Okay, so now, 283, verse 6. So Isaac settled in Gerar. Because Baruch Hu said to stay there, so he settled there. The men of the place asked about his wife. He said, she is my sister, for he was afraid to say my wife, lest the men of the place kill me because of Rebekah, for she is of fair appearance. She was a beautiful woman. You remember this kind of story? Abraham did it twice, right?
Yeah.
And so, and now those cases, the king took the wife. Here that doesn't happen. Here that doesn't happen, or almost, as we'll see. Okay. And it came to pass, as his days there lengthened, he was there a considerable amount of time, that Avimelech, king of the Philistines, gazed down through the window and saw, behold, Isaac was jesting with his wife Rebekah. That's verse 8. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says something quite striking here. It says, as his days there lengthened. Why does the Torah tell me that? Because, Rashi says, from now on, I need not worry, since they did not take her forcibly until now. So I don't have to worry that they're looking for an excuse. They didn't come to bargain. They didn't come to negotiate for me to agree to that she should marry someone. They're leaving us alone. So we don't have to worry about their intentions. So he did not take care to be cautious. And that's how Avimelech could look through the window and see them, says Rashi, having relations. How is it possible that they were having relations in the daytime, which the commentaries discuss, whether we do that or we don't do that, okay? And how is it possible that he should be able to do that and not sort of hide because they've come to the conclusion that the people are not interested in them? I suppose, according to Rashi, anyway, you'd have to make a point of looking straight through the window. That's also not normal behavior. So they just didn't take precautions about it. Yeah.
So it's saying that the king went to Yitzchak's window to look what they were doing.
So I don't know. I don't know where he was, whether he was, on the roof of the palace and Yitzchak's house was close by or something. I don't know exactly. But it means he had to make a special effort. Now, other commentators say it the other way, that normally the window was open, and on this occasion the window was closed. Now, Avimelech looked at it and says, "Why is the window closed in the middle of the day? Something must be going on in there that they don't want observed." And he calculated, not that he saw it visibly, but Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says that he saw it. Okay, so now Avimelech summoned Isaac, and he said, "But look, she's your wife. How could you say she's my sister? You lied to me. Now, he's the king. You don't lie to the king." So Isaac said, "Because I said that I might be killed because of her, just like my father did." That was his general procedure with Sarah. They lived together for decades. They traveled to many places. Only twice was there trouble. All the other times they left him alone, his brother and sister. It was a fairly good policy. And the two times when there was trouble, God intervened with a miracle to save her. He said, "I'm doing the same thing." Avimelech said, and by the way, if you're new, the paragraph breaks in the English are totally irrelevant. The Hebrew, as you can see, is one continuous text. Avimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people has nearly lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." Okay, now let's see. Avimelech is making a very peculiar statement here. Somebody, one of the people has nearly lain with your wife. Really? How would he know that? Did the guy send a note to the king? By the way, on Tuesday, I'm not coming to the conference because I have something else to do. Right? How would he know that? Furthermore, if you take a look at the Hebrew, you'll see that if you know any Hebrew, the word here is not exactly what you would expect. 5 lines from the bottom, kim'at, almost shachav le achad ha'am. Not echad ha'am, but achad ha'am. What's achad? Same letters as one, but isn't pronounced the same way. So look at Rashi. As verse 8 says, days lengthened. We did that, right? Rashi 10, one of the people, the unique one among the people, which is the king. Achad ha'am means the one among the people, not one of the people. So he's referring to himself. That's how he knew, because it was he himself who would do it. Furthermore, he's the king. They're brother and sister. They're brother and sister. Can you imagine what glory it is to be the brother-in-law of the king? Surely Abraham won't object, right? How could he have an objection? But he was already making plans. And now he says, since you really are husband and wife, if I had carried out my plans on the assumption that you are brother and sister, I would have been guilty of a terrible crime. So you see that this person isn't, as we would say, hefker. He's not a savage. He's not a barbarian. He cares about doing the right thing. He just takes it for granted that if he would take her into his harem, that everybody would be happy, including she. Not a bad life, considering the lives that men and women led in those days. Now, Rashi, you see, your translator here did Rashi's work for you. In the literal Hebrew, it says, and you have brought upon us a sin. So Rashi says, had he lain, then you would already have brought upon us a sin, but of course he didn't happen, so the sin didn't happen. And Rashi has to tell you that the Hebrew can be understood as what we call a subjunctive, a conditional. Had it happened, then there would have been, but of course it didn't happen, so there wasn't. Yeah.
Is the subjunctive the same as what's it called? Sometimes the vav is changed. It's not the same.
No. That's the Hebrew, and Hebrew is vav mapeches. I don't think we have a word for it, but we don't have it. Sometimes the letter vav, which means and, changes the tense of a verb.
Right.
So if you have a future verb and you put a vav in front of it, usually that changes it into past. Sometimes it can change past into future also. I don't think we have anything like that in English at all. No, subjunctive is, instead of saying it happened, you say it would have happened if, but didn't, because the if didn't happen. And in Hebrew, often the simple statement can be read as a subjunctive. It means to be read as a subjunctive. And here it's quite clear because it didn't happen. Now, what lesson does Avimelech take from this? Avimelech then warned all the people, saying, whoever molests this man or his wife shall be put to death. He's treating them as visitors to his land, and he's treating them with consideration and care and ensuring their safety. I think he comes across as quite honorable here. Now, so Isaac's now staying with them. Isaac sowed in that land, and that year he reaped 100-fold. Thus had Hashem blessed him. This is the only case where any of the patriarchs engaged in farming. Otherwise, they were shepherds. Isaac also was a shepherd. So there are two characteristics, and it's interesting to me that the patriarchs almost uniformly were involved in one characteristic rather than the other. As a shepherd, you are caring for living beings. You care for their health, you care for their protection. Ultimately, you do with them what you do, but in the meantime, you're caring for them. Agriculture doesn't have that. On the other hand, agriculture is subject to so many variables over which you have no control, whether it's drought or whether it's insects or whether it's plant disease and so forth and so on, that the Gemara credits agriculture as developing trust in God. It's interesting that the patriarchs were all farmers. We're all shepherds, except for this one time. Now, I do want you to look at the Hebrew here, because I want you to see the phraseology, and you'll see something which you've all heard, but may perhaps not have understood. Vayizra Yisra ba'aretz hahi, Isaac sowed in that land. Vayimsa b'shana hahi, and he found it became present to him in that year, Mea Sha'arim. Mea Sha'arim. Isn't Mea Sha'arim a place near here? Yeah, Mea Sha'arim, the place of 100 gates, right? Mea Sha'arim. Sha'ar is a gate. No, it isn't. The phrase Mea Sha'arim was taken from that place from this verse. And it meant it's small, it's concentrated. We hope for a blessing that it will grow 100-fold. That's what the name of the community there meant. And over the years, it has certainly grown tremendously. That's what Mea Sha'arim means. Okay. Now Rashi says, 12. See now, Isaac sowed in that land. If it didn't say in that land, would you have thought he was sowing elsewhere? In Kentucky? He's living in that land. Where's he going to sow? And in that year, he reaped 100-fold. Well, you're talking about what he's doing. So Rashi wants to hear, why does the verse mention where he is and how long it took? So Rashi says, in that land, even though it's not high-quality land, as the land of Israel itself. He went south of Israel, as the land of 7 nations. In that year, even though it was not in its usual way, it was an abnormal year. It was a year of famine. In that land, in that year, why are both of them stated? To tell you that the land was harsh and the year was harsh. And even so, he got 100-fold. It was a double miracle. And why does he say that? Because it leads to the next verse, where in the next verse, the Torah tells us that the Philistines envied him. One of the reasons they envied him because they were starving. Rashi says 100-fold. They assessed the field to determine how much it was fit to produce, and it produced. For every unit they estimated would produce 100 units. And just 13, the man became great and kept becoming greater until he was very great, says Rashi. For they would say, the manure of the mules of Isaac and not the silver and gold of Avimelech. Avimelech was the king. I said, he's so productive, he's so blessed, he has such a growing abundance that, now, the manure is what you use to enrich the field so that it will produce more. Obviously, the way he's doing his agriculture is superb. Right? We've never seen anything like it. So if I had an opportunity to have some of his agricultural materials, I would take that over the silver and gold of the king, because look what he's getting from it. And this means that, as we'll read in Mitzvahs Hashem, the envy starts from the king down. Because when the king hears that people are making that kind of remark, it's a certain disgrace for his honor and his glory, and he then has an animus to take care of it. Now next week in Mitzvahs Hashem, the schedule is going to be different. I'm coming at 3 o'clock and teaching from 3 to 3:45. Then you will go and light your Hanukkah Licht early, and I will light I'll light later around 6 o'clock. That's why I'm teaching them, because everybody else lights early, and I, being a chassid, light late. So now I think what I will do next week, I will start with a discussion of Hanukkah, and it will take us several days to go through some of the ideas of Hanukkah, the philosophy of Hanukkah, the practice of Hanukkah. Then either it will take the whole week, or at some point we'll get back to the Chumash with Rashi. But we'll start next week with a discussion of Hanukkah.